Bien, c'est à moi qui revient la tâche de rompre le charme de la musique pour introduire notre dernière session de ces journées consacrée aux agents, ambassadeurs et intermédiaires de la musique. Et donc, nous avons le plaisir d'accueillir Giuliano Danieli, King's College de Londres. Vous êtes là, Giuliano?
Oui, okay. I am here. Bonjour.
Même si, virtuellement. Giuliano, vous êtes diplômé en master de musicologie de l'Université de la Sapienza à Rome. Et vous avez également fait un master et un PhD en musicologie au King's College de Londres. Vous avez plusieurs champs de recherche. L'un d'entre eux, et notamment de votre doctorat, est centré sur les études cinématographiques, la relation entre la musique et l'image, et particulièrement la façon dont le cinéma italien de l'après-guerre a retravaillé la folk music. Et donc vous avez continué à creuser ce sillon-là, et parallèlement, et moi c'est comme ça que je vous connais, vous avez également, dans votre master, dépouillé le très riche fonds l'Archivio dell'Amministrazione del Principe à Modène, yeah. Et vous avez fait votre master sur la cour, les musiciens à la cour d'Ippolito d'Est, et vous en avez tiré un très beau livre, donc j'en profite pour vous le dire, puisqu'il m'a beaucoup...
Merci beaucoup.
Il y a maintenant 2 ans, ça, 2018, si j'ai de mémoire.
2018, oui.
Et donc vous êtes vous enseignez actuellement l'histoire de la musique à la Sapienza à Rome, et donc vous allez faire une communication dans la lignée de votre travail sur la chapelle du cardinal Ippolito d'Este, donc avec une communication en anglais ou en italien, je ne sais plus.
En anglais, en English, yeah.
Cultural mobility and early modern patronage, music at the courts of Ippolito d'Este. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this introduction, and thank you for organizing the conference as well, and for the concert too. It was very enjoyable. So I will share my presentation and then I will start. So let me know if you cannot see it. You should be able to see the slides of my presentation. Okay. So 1 second. Okay. Renaissance cardinals, their courts and patronage have been receiving increasing attention in the past decade. As claimed by Glenn Richardson, scholars have portrayed cardinals not only as high churchmen, ecclesiastical dignitaries, or theologians, but as papal ambassadors, as other kinds of representatives to and from the papacy, and as political and cultural brokers. In-betweenness was the distinctive trait of many cardinals, since they often performed the role of political and cultural intermediaries between Rome, their families or countries of origins, and other countries' agents with whom they came into contact. To accomplish their diplomatic goals, they spent a large amount of time traveling between different countries. Princes of the church held their own courts, which obviously included artists and musicians. The fact that cardinals were not related to a single capital city, but performed their diplomatic functions across many places and with international clienteles, however, determined that the structures of their courts and at the musical level of their cappelle musicali were often different from the ones of other courts of the Renaissance. However, historiographers and musicologists have rarely devoted their efforts to defining the distinctive spaces of the cardinals' courts. The historiographical problem of the court and its space has been explored especially with reference to monarchs, dukes, and other prominent political figures, but we're still far from providing a nuanced typology of the Renaissance courts. Focusing on the Italian context, the dominant model of Renaissance court describes it as a self-contained space, a cohesive center, usually associated with a capital city or the territory of a single state. In La Corte e lo Spazio, Quondam and Papagno admit that such centers were in continuous exchange with other centers and peripheries, but they repeatedly define the Renaissance court as a focal point towards which different spaces and agencies converge and are held together by the figure of the prince. Geometrically, this understanding of the court can be represented as a point. In a seminal article published in 1995, however, Trevor Dean has tried to mobilize this conception of the court, claiming that there were many varieties and variables that influenced the shape and spaces of the Renaissance court, and that the incongruencies, inner conflict, and fragmentation within courts were often as strong as their apparent coherence and convergence toward an ideal and spatial center. I think that this fluid understanding of the court proves particularly effective when one deals with the Renaissance cardinals for their aforementioned in-betweenness and mediating role and their detachment from a single geographical center. In this paper, I will try to address two general questions. One, is it possible by focusing on cardinal courts to provide spatial and geometrical models that call into question the idea of a court as a closed center or focal point? And second, more importantly for musicologists, is it possible to mobilize and decentralize the idea of Renaissance cappella musicale, intended not as a single group of musicians if internally changing, but as a fragmented and fluid musical space? To approach these questions, I will focus on the case of Ippolito d'Este II, Cappella Musicale and Court. For a long time, musicologists have neglected the musical patronage of this cardinal, a situation that contrasted starkly with that of the other members of the Este family, notably the Dukes of Ferrara, about whom a considerable amount of musicological research has been produced. Scholars' preference for the musical activities of the ducal court has perhaps been influenced by the incorrect assumption that those members of the Este family who did not act as secular rulers merely adopted the patronage strategies of their ducal counterparts. In fact, the conglomeration of courtly spaces that belonged to the different members of the Este family did not revolve around one single center, that is the ducal court, but they were composed of distinct units, each of which had their own individual structures and patronage policies. This is the case of Ippolito d'Este II, who was particularly concerned to project a public image of himself which was distinct from those of the other members of his lineage. I will demonstrate this point by analyzing moments in the early history of his Cappella Musicale. Musical data resulting from an extensive research I carried out at the Archivio di Stato in Modena will be interpreted in the light of Ippolito's political career. Secondly, the history of Ippolito's musical entourage will enable me to highlight the structural singularity of his court and of his Cappella Musicale. Indeed, because of his diplomatic and religious roles as papal legate and Ferrari's cardinal protector of France, Ippolito spent a large amount of time traveling back and forth between Italy and France. Thus, he was not associated with only one space and one court, as was the case with the Dukes of Ferrara. This factor, along with Ippolito's efforts to stress the uniqueness of his princely identity, determined the structural specialty of his court, one of the main distinguishing features of which was what I defined its mobility. With this term, that I borrow from the scholarly field of the mobility studies, I want to highlight first the ramification of Ippolito's court and cappella into many different sub-courts, notably Fontainebleau, Rome, Tivoli, and Ferrara, and second, the dynamism of the structure of each one of these sub-courts, whose dimension and composition changed in connection with Ippolito's needs and movements. I hope that my analysis of the mobile nature of Ippolito's court and cappella will challenge the model of the Renaissance court as a monofocal center, whilst simultaneously drawing attention on the importance of cultural exchanges that a polycentric court and its agents could activate. Ippolito II was born in 1509 and was destined for an ecclesiastical career. Alfonso I and Lucrezia Borgia hoped that their second-born son would become cardinal, like his uncle Ippolito I, in order to play an influential diplomatic role on an international level and intervene in the politics of Rome. This was crucial for the Ferrarese dukes, since the Pope wanted to reassume control of this territory and restore Ferrara's prior status to that of a fiefdom of the Papal State. The route to acquiring the Red Galero was often achieved via the formation of a splendid court. A cardinal had to be magnificent in that material wealth was considered a synonym of moral qualities. Unsurprisingly, then, the young Ippolito was immediately concerned to enhance his public image by gathering an entourage of skilled servants, including some musicians. In 1525, Ippolito's Cappella Musicale comprised Adrian Villaert, Francesco della Viola, and a rather less well-known singer called Bersano. All of them had previously worked for other members of the Este family, notably Alfonso I and Ippolito I. Given Ippolito's, one second, there is a technical problem. I think there is someone who is requiring the control of my screen. I don't know, I'm refusing it. Just, okay, sorry. All of these musicians, I was saying, had previously worked for other members of the Este family, notably Alfonso I and Ippolito I. Given Ippolito's young age, combined with the fact that he lived with his relatives in Ferrara until 1536, it seems unsurprising that he drew his musicians from the court of his father and his uncle. This observation is by no means limited to his musicians. Indeed, most of the Ippolito's entourage bore the distinctive stamp of the ducal court, as did the palaces he lived in, San Francesco, Belfiore, and Paradiso, which were fine examples of Ferrarese architecture. As long as Ippolito's life did not imply physical movement from a city or state to another, his court and his Cappella Musicale kept a cohesive form and internal configuration that descended directly from the model of the ducal court of Ferrara. This situation only changed when Ippolito left his hometown. This happened in 1536, when Francis I Valois finally persuaded Alfonso I to send his son to France in order to reinvigorate his strategic alliance with Ferrara. In March 1536, Ippolito moved to Lyon, where the king and his retinue were temporarily situated. His primary aims were to gain France's trust and to flaunt a magnificence that would impress the French courtiers. With this in mind, he embarked on his journey with many members of his household, which resulted in significant modification in the original configuration of his court. The names of the servants who traveled with Ippolito are recorded in a 1536 register, which also allow us to ascertain that the cardinal's household was divided into two main branches at this time. The first comprised 100 courtiers who followed Ippolito beyond the Alps, while the second featured another group of servants who remained in Ferrara to manage his properties. Ippolito's musical entourage also reflects this bifurcation. For example, Francesco della Viola traveled to Lyon with Ippolito, whereas Bersano remained in the palace of San Francesco in Ferrara. Francesco della Viola was more revered than Bersano and definitely held in higher esteem by his patron. Indeed, the former, Francesco, was paid 13 lire marchesane per month in 1536, in contrast to Bersano, who only received 5 lire. This suggests that Ippolito purposefully selected the best members of his household to accompany him on his first visit to France, namely the ones who had the greatest potential to enhance his public image. Curiously, however, Ippolito ultimately decided to send Francesco della Viola back to Ferrara just 1 year after his arrival in France. It may be that della Viola did not fully meet the musical tastes of the Valois court, with the fact that his presence there was no longer desired. His decision could also be explained by the fact that Renée de France, the wife of Duke Ercole II, had decided to move into Ippolito's San Francisco palace following his departure to France in 1536. Ippolito may have felt that della Viola would contribute to a more refined ambience, which he considered appropriate for this important guest. Whatever the exact reason for Francesco della Viola's departure from France, His case nonetheless illustrates the fluidity that Ippolito's Cappella Musicale acquired when he began his international diplomatic career. In effect, it became necessary for him to spread both his musician and other members of his household across all of the spaces where his power was represented, including the ones where he was not physically present. The trajectory of each courtier's movement was determined by how effectively they could serve Ippolito's purposes in his different sub-courts. As for his musicians, Ippolito had to accommodate his cappella to the particular tastes of the locals, depending on whether these were French or Ferrarese. This is apparent when one considers that, following Francesco della Viola's departure from France, Ippolito hired a group of 7 French musicians who, for their provenance, might be closer to French musical tastes. At this time, then, Ippolito's cappella started acquiring a distinctive identity, far removed from the Ferrarese environment and strongly hybridized in nature. Ippolito's ability to adapt his entourage to the surrounding context played no small part in ensuring the admiration of Francis I, who personally interceded with Pope Paul III in order to obtain the red hat for Ippolito. He was finally appointed cardinal on March 1539. After receiving the investiture in Rome, Ippolito headed for France again. This was the official start of Ippolito's diplomatic career. From this moment on, he began traveling back and forth from Italy to France, where he spent most of his time, having been nominated cardinal protector in 1548. The polycentric structure of Ippolito's court became increasingly apparent, particularly in a spatial sense. The new villa in Fontainebleau, the Hôtel du Grand Ferrare, commissioned to Sebastiano Serlio in 1541, was just one of many palaces where Ippolito and his household could reside, since the cardinal owned properties in Ferrara and from 1549 in Rome and Tivoli. All of these palaces had a symbolic resonance in that their architectural and decorative features were intentionally created to exhibit the cardinal's distinctive identity. This identity became more and more culturally hybridized as Ippolito's life acquired dynamism. It comes as no surprise then that the Grand Ferrare, even though it was designed and decorated in a predominantly Italian style, featured French traits, among them the inclusion of a space for the jeu de paume. The physical fragmentation and cultural hybridity visible in the cardinal's residencies is also apparent in the formation and evolvement of his musical entourage. Between 1540 and 1551, the cardinal's cappella underwent a process of gradual Frenchification. But how were Ippolito's singers distributed across these many sub-courts? Even if most of the registers of this time are lost, especially the one regarding the life of Ippolito's French sub-courts, from the surviving documentation, it is possible to argue that singers Abello and Bersano traveled from Ferrara to Fontainebleau between August and December 1540 and remained in France in the following months, probably with other French singers, Nicolas d'Adam, Contino, and Murillo. Musicians that Ippolito needed for the lavish feast that he was organizing at the Grand Ferrare for the king and his courtiers. Although Ippolito spent most of his time in France in the 1540s, his Ferrarese sub-courts was not devoid of music making. Francesco della Viola, who had joined the cardinal on his 1540 journey to France, returned to Ferrara as early as September. In 1547, he was joined by a new musician from France who had probably served Ippolito in the years prior to this point, Alessandro Grappella, alias Spinetta. This once again enables us to observe the fluidity of Ippolito's Cappella Musicale, whose members, both French and Italian musicians, were often moved around like chess pieces. In light of this observation, it is worth mentioning a missive that Ippolito wrote to Ercole in 1547, within which he asked the Duke to take back in Ferrara 2 Italian instrumentalists who had been serving in Fontainebleau for an undefined period of time. An excerpt reads like, Francesco Cremonese dearly prayed me to beg your majesty not only to forgive him and Antonio, another one of his brother who resides here, but also taking them under your wing to demand their service again. Although they are highly regarded here and they earn a wage of 10 scudi per month, they would be happy with a smaller wage because they wish to serve your majesty and because they regret that the people here do not have enough patience to listen to them playing from the score, preferring instead to be entertained with dances and gagliarde. The expression sonare al libro in the original letter, like playing from the score, hints at the complexity of the repertoire that was performed by Francesco and Antonio Cremonese, which was almost certainly polyphonic in nature. This was not particularly appreciated by the French listeners, as far as we can say from this letter. The letter suggests a marked difference in taste between the Italian and French environments, the latter of which apparently favored lighter musical entertainment, suon di balli and gagliarde. The fact that Ippolito interceded personally with the Duke about Francesco and Antonio Cremonese being sent back to Ferrara is meaningful because it illustrates how the Cardinal reorganized his entourage according to the implicit requirements of the various cultural and musical spaces with which he came into contact. In other words, Ippolito acted as a cultural mediator, and this, along with the fluidity of his court and his capella, was determined by the high degree of mobility resulting from his diplomatic role. The culturally hybridized identity that epitomized Ippolito's entourage and his subcourt in these years was thus connected with the heavy flow of people that this function of mediator initiated. I have no space here to present further examples of the several transformations of Ippolito's subcourt and Cappella Musicale after 1550. Suffice it to say that Ippolito's Cappella continued to change rapidly and to be scattered through the cardinal subcourts. Toward the end of his life, however, Ippolito collected a number of diplomatic defeats, which condemned him to political and physical inertia. After 1563, he stopped traveling to France, residing for the most part in Rome and Tivoli. This had consequences on the shape of his court and capella. From 1564, Ippolito's musical entourage lost its pronounced French traits and became a far more compact and stable organism than it had been before, with a majority of musicians coming from Rome or Italian territoires. It did not lose magnificence, though. On the contrary, in this period, Ippolito devoted substantial resources to his musical and artistic patronage, probably to counterbalance his political failure. However, the heavy traffic of musicians and by extension of cultures that his diplomat role had facilitated was no longer able to flow. Ippolito's capella and court lost its hybridized traits and also its polycentric nature. This was certainly a direct result of Ippolito's ties with France having been cut and his mobility having diminished. In mobility and urban space in early modern Europe, Luca Zenobi, building on the theoretical framework of mobility studies of scholars such as John Arry and Stephen Greenblatt, has claimed that urban spaces shaped mobility as much as mobility shaped urban spaces. In the same way as movement gave meaning and shape to the early modern cities, as Zenobi says, we can argue that mobilities influenced the structure of the Renaissance court of diplomats and vice versa, that their polycentric international courts and the diplomats' role of political and cultural mediators shaped movement, a movement of people, objects, and ideas, as well as of musicians and musical repertoires. It was a twofold process, which I think should be further explored by historians and musicologists. In this paper, I've tried to do so by reconstructing the early history of Ippolito d'Este II Cappella Musicale and connecting it to the distinctive traits of Ippolito's court. As I have shown, a fundamental aspect of Ippolito's patronage was the mobility that his diplomatic role provoked. His court did not have one single ideal center, a capital, as was the Ducal Ferrara, but was multipolar, a fluid and international web of spaces and contact zones that were in dynamic relationship with the multifarious destinations and interlocutors that the cardinal had as a diplomat. In other words, Ippolito's court and Cappella Musicale were polycentric. Its agents and musicians were scattered in all of the international locations where the cardinal's power was exerted, and their contacts with diverse cultural environments created important instances of cultural mobility. By highlighting the ever-changing nature of this aspect, I think that we are better equipped to appreciate the fact that the early modern world and its court were rather less static than is assumed by monocentric models. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great paper. You introduce subtlety and also difficulty, I guess, in our vision of notion of patronage in early modern Italy and Europe in general. Can we ask question in Italian and French? Even,
yeah, please. Even in French, I will.
Even
in French is fine. Should be fine.
Okay, we'll speak slowly.
I can hear.
There is a question from Don Father, please.
Yes, thank you for a great paper. It's very, very interesting and thought-provoking. I wonder, do you know anything about the repertoire sung by or performed by these hybrid groups of musicians? Did that change as well?
Yeah, I think this is a point that I should probably do more research about, because from the papers that I found, from the documents that I was able to find in the archives and in libraries as well, I mostly did my research in Modena, as I said in the paper. I wasn't able to find precise indications of what these musicians were performing. So I think that some research could be made in order to find some, I mean, obviously the most obvious thing to do, and which I actually did, is to look at the dedicacies on the musical works for Ippolito and so on, which I did obviously for my research, but I did not find really compelling evidence of the daily musical repertoire which was performed at the different subcourts, as I call them, of Ippolito during time. So yes, this is definitely a point that needs to be researched a little bit more. The problem is that in many cases, as usual in the Renaissance, of most of the daily practice of music in the courts, it is impossible to say what was exactly performed, because unless we have some chronicles or some, I don't know, other kind of more private sources, sometimes like letters, for example, well, if we don't have these documents, it becomes very difficult to find a trace of the musical repertoires, because they were basically just extemporized rather than necessarily written down and printed. So it's obviously a kind of difficulty, but I think that by looking more carefully at the letters, for example, exchanged between especially the other diplomats of the time who maybe attended the musical events in Ippolito's villas, I think it would be that would be a good source for knowledge in this sense. But I'm pretty sure that obviously a kind of exchange was happening. The letter that I quoted was one of the few examples that I could bring in order to support this statement. But I think it's I mean, I'm saying it by, in Italian is a buon senso, but I don't know the English or the French expression for this. It's not enough for an academic, obviously, evidence, but it's definitely a starting point for further research. So thank you for this observation, because I think it's very important. It's a very important point.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the difficulties about studying a mobile court or a mobile group of people. You don't have a single place in which to look for sources. You have to look in various places, and that's particularly difficult with musical sources. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you very much.
I would have maybe a question inspired by Don Fader observation. Do you think that the chromatic and harmonic music of Vicentino created a kind of a sonic sound around Ippolito Due that could have also a kind of who could have participated in the creation of decorum, estense decorum or something like that, or a political image, or it was only curiosity for something very subtle and almost esoteric at this time?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. To be honest, I don't have an answer for this. I obviously know that Vicentino was one of the main characters in the Cappella Musicale of Ippolito. He also received the Ippolito's protection in some arguments that he had at the time. So yes, there was obviously a strong connection. And what I can say is that probably, if I remember well, because to be honest, it's a research that I did several years ago, but if I remember well, in some of the collection of motet, especially that were dedicated to Ippolito, I noticed that there was a number of singers involved in the performance, a number of voci, which could be connected with some kind of complexities that were inspired maybe also by the new and experimentalist style that you mentioned. But yes, to be honest, apart from this, I cannot really respond to this question because I don't have any evidence about that. As I said, unfortunately, if I have to be self-reflective, obviously, my research has the problem of not having dealt really in detail with some aspect of the musical styles and musical exchanges. It was more a research focusing on the production system of the time. So obviously there is much more work to do, and I hope to do it in the next few years, or I hope that other scholars will do it in order to, yes, to deal more in detail with problem of musical language and stylistic exchanges of music at the time. But yeah.
Thank you. Maybe Ippolito Due was more useful to Vicentino than the contrary. It's also
yes, probably, absolutely. That's for sure.
Any questions? Ok. S'il n'y a pas d'autres questions, je regarde aussi dans la salle virtuelle. J'ai pas l'impression qu'il y ait de questions. Et comme on est un tout petit peu en retard, eh bien, je vais introduire notre communicant suivant. Merci beaucoup, Giuliano.
Thank you very much. Thank you.